Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news, which as usual has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully, you are having an amazing day. We have an awful lot of cool stuff to get through today, and there are some very interesting things in an AMD corporate presentation which is dated the 5th of June 2020. In this fairly lengthy presentation, which I will link of course in the video description, AMD have highlighted several interesting things regarding their technology and provided lots of clarification to RDNA 2 as well as their upcoming CPU roadmaps. I will skip the first, let's say, several pages of this presentation because while it does discuss things like total available market available to AMD, some of their philosophies around design and so on, I don't think it quite fits what I'm looking to focus on in this video. I will once again link it in the video description anyway, so you can check the presentation out if you would desire. But I would like to start on page 10 with AMD being the only company in the world with both high performance compute and high performance graphics. This is not anything new, it's AMD just boasting here, obviously being the only company with a high performance x86 CPU solution with the Zen cores, and then obviously you've got graphics, and AMD actually have two variants of graphics which will be coming to the fray. Well, by which of course I mean gaming focused GPUs as well as compute focused ones, although CDNA has not technically launched yet, but we do know it's coming, and AMD have actually provided a tiny bit more insight into that in this particular presentation, which we'll get to in a moment. This is something that AMD won't be able to boast for much longer. Obviously, Intel will be getting into the world of discrete graphics, and they are slowly getting there. They are actually focusing on the server/high performance computing market first. Gaming will come later. But I understand that Intel's high-performance computing solutions are actually shaping up to be pretty good. They've obviously gone with kind of a chiplet type of design, which they are referring to as tiles. And this type of design will naturally also filter its way to AMD and Nvidia's solution. Nvidia are the odd duck out here. They do not have an x86 processor. Naturally, they can work with other CPUs. For example, what we've seen with the Shield or the Nintendo Switch type of SoCs, and that's certainly one way to go. But some companies, some solutions just require x86, so AMD definitely have kind of a leg up there, and it's going to be fascinating to me to see how all of this evolves. Next couple of pages are just going over things we already know about Zen and Zen 2. They have obviously pointed out that the original Zen architecture was an entirely new x86 core design, 52% IPC uplift over the excavator, multi-chip design, which was enabled by Infinity Fabric, and it was also designed, of course, around enterprise solutions. Naturally, this turned into several different products. We all know, of course, the first generation Ryzen series Epic, which was extremely successful, going up to 32 cores, and then obviously you have Threadripper as well, which was actually something AMD had not originally intended. This is kind of documented. This was something that kind of popped up later. AMD had not originally decided to create a high-performance computing solution for the home, or HEDT to be precise, high-end desktop solution. So this was something that kind of came almost last minute as a side project, and obviously Threadripper now it's pretty synonymous with AMD, and they've definitely scored a lot of brownie points with power users with the Threadripper platform, and clearly with the I/O connectivity as well, which is obviously moving now to the Zen 2 core architecture, which AMD are happy to point out is faster, cooler, with low power consumption for servers, laptops, and desktops. And this really was kind of the big thing, because now we're starting to see laptops which really take advantage of the 7nm processor from the company with Renoir. But now, let's get on to the nitty-gritty. So, 2017 is when we first saw the Zen processor architecture launch. and quite honestly, I don't understand how it's been so long. Obviously, the original implementation was on the 14nm process, and then we saw Zen Plus, which was on the 12nm process. The Plus brought slight improvements in clock frequency, and there were also some tweaks to the cache design. And obviously that meant that products like the 2700X were a pretty nice uplift in games in some instances. It wasn't a huge bump or anything like that. It was around a 3% IPC gain and then a tiny bit more simply because of clock frequency. But the big leap, of course, was Zen 2, where we saw a 15% IPC gain, and the Ryzen 3000 series also did things like doubling the core count as well, which meant we have 16 cores, 32 threads on a mainstream platform, although obviously the 3950X is not exactly a cheap CPU, but even so. And right there, those two solutions with the first generation Ryzen and then the third generation Ryzen, yes, they brought big increases in performance in terms of IPC, especially given AMD's previous architectures. We all know that Excavator wasn't exactly the best friend for gaming, although I will say the 8350, for example, from AMD was a pretty decent budget CPU, especially if you didn't just game, if you did some like multimedia creation. It had some other uses as well, and it was a pretty decently priced CPU, especially given even a more budget-focused motherboard could overclock, which was obviously an advantage over Intel. But anyway, one of the big things with those two CPUs, so two generations, excuse me, is the fact that we saw a doubling of the mainstream core count compared to Intel with, let's say, the 6700 and 7700Ks, which only had 4 cores. This went to 8 cores, and then obviously with the Ryzen 3000 series, I will again say that that doubled to 16 cores. But I want you to pay close attention here, because they are saying that Zen 3 is going to be on the 7nm process. And this seems to fly in the face of what we learned from DigiTimes just recently. The retired engineer did a really good job at translating the DigiTimes article, and they claim that we will actually see Zen 3 potentially even use 5nm. Now, this was definitely something which raised a lot of eyebrows, because you can't just be like copy paste. This is not like you taking an image into Photoshop, going to image resize, and then reducing the percentage like whatever, and that's it. It doesn't work like that. Obviously, not only do you need to rechange the design and retape things back out, but then you have to validate the design that actually doesn't explode, and so on and so on. So it's an awful lot of work. And then, anyway, we'll put a pin on the 7nm thing, because, well, there's another slide that I find rather curious. Anyway, moving on from that, then we have 5nm, and this is for, of course, the Zen 4 architecture. Now, notice this is compute architecture for high performance leadership. So that does seem to scupper the 5nm rumors for AMD's Ryzen 4000 series, despite the fact that DigiTimes do have typically really good sources. But let's move on and get back to it in a moment, because in slide 14, or page 14, whatever you want to say, AMD's RDNA 2 graphics architecture is for new high-performance design. Obviously, for gaming workstation workloads, it was a 50% improvement per watt, enhances features, and from mobile to cloud. And then RDNA 2 focuses on improving the performance per watt, building on, quote, proven CPU design methodology, microarchitecture innovation, which is improving performance per clock, IPC. There's also logic enhancements, reduce complexity in switching performance, and physical optimization, which increases the clock frequency. So there's a lot in this slide if you start digging. Like, come on, get a spade with me. Come on, start digging, damn it. On a serious note for a second, there's a lot in here, but let's just wait for a second, go through the next slide, which is page 16, before we really analyze this stuff. So the RDNA first generation was obviously optimized for gaming. Now, back in March of last year, this is what I leaked. I leaked the fact that the first generation of RDNA was kind of the last big hurrah of Raja Koduri at Intel, and his job was to at least put the fundamental building blocks of an architecture which was designed for gaming. That was the whole purpose of RDNA. And I also, of course, leaked the fact that there would be a compute-based architecture as well, although at the time we didn't know what it was called. We then started to hear rumours of Arcturus, and now of course we know that it's CDNA, which is kind of a spiritual successor-ish of Vega. But anyway, the next generation was RDNA 2, which once again AMD is stating here has ray tracing, variable rate shading, and more. But there's also performance per watt improvements as well. So let's put a kind of a spin on this and figure out what we've learned. So if we go back to slide 15, in terms of performance per watt, AMD are stating that from GCN to the first generation of RDNA is a 50% improvement. Now, I have to say that I don't believe the first generation of RDNA is exactly what you'd expect given it's a 7nm process. I would actually say that Nvidia kick its butt, despite the fact that Turing was on a 12nm process. However, comparing it to what we saw with even the later iterations of GCN, it was quite a revelation. But now, if we compare RDNA first generation to RDNA second generation, we can again see a pretty significant leap, exactly the same apparently from the first generation to the second. So if we take that on face value, we should see a significant improvement from the first generation to the second generation. Now notice they also state that it's using proven CPU design methodology. What AMD have stated is that some of the individuals who are key for the power optimization for the Zen architecture, as well as of course its subsequent derivatives, were tasked by the company to basically optimize their GPU design as well. And this is laborious stuff. You can't really automate this. You have to kind of go in, manually tweak things, optimize things in the design to make sure it's as power efficient as possible. And this was actually something that I got told, and I was covering as well as an exclusive, that RDNA 2 is probably going to be the architecture which best shows this off, as now the team have really optimized it. And that's one of the reasons, apparently, that we are seeing here logic enhancements as well as reduced complexity and switching performance. Now notice, that brings us to the power efficiency, but there's two other things that are pretty obvious. The first is that there's an improvement in terms of performance per watt. Performance per clock. Now I'm getting bloody mixed up the reverse. Anyway, performance per clock has improved IPC, which basically means the GPU is going to do more work for its respective clock frequency, which is obviously a really good thing. And it's going to be fascinating because this is adding to the fact that we see increased clock frequency. Now, I've speculated this several billion times in the past, simply based on what we've seen for the Xbox Series X as well as the PlayStation 5. With the PS5, it runs up to 2230 megahertz, and with the Xbox Series X, we're seeing 1825 megahertz. Now, you may say, well, 1825, is that really that impressive? Yes, considering the power envelope of the system. It's 300-ish watts, and that is with everything. That 300 watts is powering the CPU, the GPU, the SSD, the game controllers, if you've got them plugged in and charging or whatever. Everything is running off of that 300 watts, which is a testament to just how the APU itself from Microsoft is sipping power like a fine wine. It is not just guzzling this thing down. And for 52 compute units plus 8 CPU cores, all screaming at high clock frequencies relative to a console anyway, that is not a small feat. That's very impressive. And the PlayStation 5, exactly the same thing. You're looking at a CPU which is running at around 3.5 gigahertz. Obviously, you've got 2230 megahertz for the GPU, and yes, that clock frequency does adjust itself a little bit depending on workload, but even so, according to Mark Cerny, and this is backed up by several developers I'm speaking to, that is not something that just like tanks. The frequency adjusts very, very small amounts, and even if you reduce the power going into the GPU, for example, by 10%, apparently it's only a couple of percent loss on the GPU's clock frequency. I don't really want to get too much onto the console stuff here. I'm just simply saying that all of this makes sense when you then say, well, the RDNA 2 is apparently up to 80 compute units. And this naturally means that the GPU is most likely much higher in clock frequency compared to the first generation. So I personally believe we're going to see at least 2-ish gigahertz for RDNA 2. I would not be surprised if it's higher. And obviously that will also depend on the variant you're buying. I'm sure that companies like Power Color and Sapphire or whomever are going to probably have the screaming high-end cards, which are like bleeding edge, best coolers and all of this stuff. But I certainly would not be surprised if AMD's GPUs hit like 2000 megahertz at a pure minimum, probably higher than that. And I think this is probably one of the reasons that Nvidia had to do this stuff that we've heard recently. The rumors are that they've scrapped GA103 and they are now using GA102 for the RTX 3080 cards, which is definitely an indication that AMD are putting pressure on Nvidia. Anyway, that's enough of that for now. We can talk about GPUs a lot more in depth in another video because it's already getting quite lengthy and there is a lot more we need to talk about. So now let's mosey on to page 18 and you'll notice that CDNA is summarized here. So we will see 7nm CDNA, which is obviously the compute-based architecture. It's using the second generation of AMD Infinity Fabric, which is also somewhat mentioned in the page above, page 17. And then we will see an advanced node. They don't state what node that is, so we can presume it might be 5nm. It could be like, 0nm for all we know. Obviously I'm joking, but you get my point. And they are stating that that's going to be the third generation AMD Infinity Fabric, and it extends to exascale, which is going to be very interesting. I'm also going to skip several pages because they start discussing things in the data center, which I don't want to focus on in this video. So instead, I will skip us down to page 30 and 31, and here notice, once again, 7nm Zen 3 third generation Milan. Obviously that is in reference to the server processors. And then we have Genoa after that, which is based on the Zen 4 microarchitecture, which is going to be on 5nm. And switching to the AMD Data GPU roadmap, much the same thing as previously. Second generation AMD Infinity architecture, which is optimized for machine learning and high performance computing. So basically these couple of slides have essentially just regurgitated what was said previously, albeit focused on the data center. But now if we skip down to page 42, here's where things get really interesting because there are 3 Zen processors in relation to Ryzen, and notice that they have not stated the process node here. So this is the only thing I will say that gives the DigiTimes rumor any hope to still be true, because it's kind of weird that they've not stated the process node in these particular slides. Obviously, if it was a case where it did have, for example, 7nm for Zen 2 and 14nm for first generation Zen, and then it was blank for Zen 3, it would be more of a smoking gun. But they've just not stated that at all. So I would say that this is the only evidence, and I put that extremely loosely, but there is validity on the DigiTimes rumor. I would personally say that at this point, take the Ryzen 4000 being on the 7nm the 5nm process very much with a grain of salt, which is something I've always said to begin with, because it would require quite a lot of work. On the other hand, we don't know for certain either way. I've not heard anything from my sources. I've asked a couple of people and I can't get any information there. So I would just say that just take the 5nm information with Zen 3 with a massive pinch of salt. The final thing I would bring your attention to is AMD have finally doubled down on the fact that RDNA 3 is in development. This is on page 50 for those playing at home. RDNA 3, Navi 3X, whatever you want to call it. They are once again pointing out it's on an advanced node, but are hesitant to actually mention what that node is. We can assume it's 5nm, or it could be something entirely different. There's no actual statements yet on what the features are for RDNA 3 compared to RDNA 2. And unfortunately, I've not heard much about the RDNA 3 architecture. So overall, we've learned quite a bit about AMD's kind of goals. It appears that RDNA 2 is going to be what we had thought it would be. It's going to be quite the GPU. I still don't know if AMD will grab the performance crown from Nvidia. I suspect Nvidia will do anything they can. If they have to bolt a bloody refrigerator to the side of the GPU to keep it cool enough to crank the clock frequencies up, if they have to harness the power of a star to power the damn thing and a black hole to grab out all the heat from the GPU, that's what they'll do. I think they will probably crank the clock frequencies higher than normal, assuming Nvidia do face the pressure from AMD that I think many of us suspect. They will probably crank the clock frequencies up way higher than what is optimal in the frequency/power curve. And this could be kind of a role reversal for what we see normally with AMD. Normally it's AMD the ones that are on the back foot and forced to crank their clock frequencies up, which is one of the reasons, of course, we see the GPUs be kind of hot. It's simply because they are cranking their clock frequencies up of their GPUs a little bit higher than perhaps would be optimal, just to get as much performance out of them as possible. Either way, I think this next generation war between Nvidia and AMD is going to be a lot closer, and it's going to be really nice because it may, and I stress that word, it may help bring down the prices a little bit. So, I have a question. Do you want an update to the PlayStation 5 reveal date? Well, of course you do. And it is this Thursday. We're going to see the event take place at 1 PM PDT and 9 PM BST. So this event has been, well, let's just be honest, rather anticipated. And it has been confirmed on the PlayStation official blog by Sid Schumann, who is the Senior Director of SIE Content Communications. I'll read out a couple of very interesting quotes, though, for this particular announcement. Now that the event is confirmed for June 11, I wanted to add that this is a pre-taped program and will be broadcast at 1080p, 30 FPS. This eased the show's production process during a time where many of our team and developers are working from home. The games you see on Thursday will look even better when you play them on a PS5 and a 4K television. It's also best if you watch while wearing headphones, if you can, as there's some cool audio work on the show, which may be harder to appreciate if you're pumping it through your phone or laptop speakers. And then obviously they go on to state that the PlayStation 5 event will show off various aspects of the console, various launch games, and so on and so on. I wonder if we're going to see some idea of what Sony are doing with their audio output. Obviously, that was discussed a hell of a lot during the Road to PS5 event. So perhaps when we're watching the event, we'll see some idea of what the Tempest engine is actually capable of. Either way, I'm very much looking forward to the event. I would encourage you below to kind of leave your comments of what you think will be shown at the event. Obviously, There's a ridiculous amount of rumors at this point. We've heard everything from Bloodborne being shown off for the next generation PlayStation and obviously a PC port. Dusk Golem on Twitter is stating that Resident Evil 8 will be shown at the event, or at least he's pretty confident of it. I believe he said 99% confident. And at this point, honestly, I just want to see some next generation gameplay. I feel Microsoft have learned a lot of lessons from what they with the show that they last put on. Obviously, they got a lot of flack. Although, to be fair, I think Ubisoft also kind of deserved a lot of that as well. I think that I don't blame them for not necessarily showing some of the gameplay, in that obviously with what's going on with the working from home environment right now, I think some teams are being stretched to their absolute limit. I think it was more of a problem with what they promised rather than what they actually delivered. I think if they'd have just gone ahead and called it a sneak peek and, this is just a preview and some kind of ideas of what we're going to get with the next generation and hadn't really pushed the whole gameplay side of things, people would have been a lot kinder to the event. But as I said, they have taken that on board, and apparently we will be getting a massive amount of games, obviously, with the Xbox event, which is coming up soon. Sony will be drawing first blood, so to speak, by really, I think, showing off their big event. I don't know if we're going to see pricing information on the PlayStation 5. Hopefully we do, but I kind of expect it to be a little bit later on in the year, simply because I think that they're going to want some ammo left to fire at Microsoft later on. Either way, I'm really hyped to see what both Sony and Microsoft are going to be bringing to the table. I think that the games on offer are going to be fantastic. I do wonder if this is going to be a start of Sony developing a lot more games for the PC as well, or at the very least reducing the time period from them appearing to the PlayStation and then obviously coming onto the PC. It'll be fascinating to see if that's the case, because I think many would agree that the PC is kind of the neutral platform in many ways. But either way, yup, 1080p 30 FPS is what they're going to be showing this at, which is kind of surprising, actually. I am surprised that they're not showing it at 1080p 60 FPS, given obviously they could do that if it's a pre-recorded session on YouTube. You can upload 1080p 60 FPS no problem. I wonder, and this is me being a little paranoid, I wonder if this is so that people cannot go in and then run frame rate analysis tools on unfinished hardware, or say unfinished software, with obviously the idea of trying to figure out what the performance of next generation is, because obviously if they notice that the frame rate dips from 60 FPS down to like 52 for a few seconds, yeah, people are going to be kind of annoyed about that, but you can kind of blame YouTube compression and stuff otherwise. I'm not saying that this is the case. This is not from insider information. I am just guessing. But that would be something I would do if I was in the PR department of either Sony or Microsoft. And Microsoft did the same thing as well for a couple of their demos. And obviously we saw AMD do this as well with the ray tracing demos of RDNA 2. They encoded it at 30 FPS. And obviously it's a very good way to just simply not show the performance metrics of the system. I'm not saying that is the case. This is just speculation. And I will now move us on to some Xbox stuff. There is a very interesting thing which is in regards to Lockhart. There is actually references in the operating system that we can see Xbox Lockhart. Just to clarify, this is in the Windows OS libraries, and you can see several entries here. There's Anaconda, there's Scorpio, there's Durango, which are obviously different Xbox SKUs. We've got Scorpio, of course, which was the Xbox One X, Durango, which was the original Xbox One, Anaconda is the Xbox Series X, and Lockhart, well, obviously, that's supposedly the lower-end system. Now, Windows Central's Jez Gordon has said that developers he's spoken to have confirmed that they are targeting the console. And the thing is, it's kind of interesting because there's no real major leaks for the plans from Microsoft, whether we're going to see Lockhart launch at the same time as the Xbox Series X. The primary difference to our understanding thus far is that Lockhart is very similar to Series X, albeit with the major cuts being in the GPU performance, which does raise questions of how developers themselves will feel about targeting the different spec machines. I've heard everything from it's not going to really be a problem to developers not really liking it as much. I don't think it's going to be catastrophic. One of the primary reasons behind that, of course, is a lot of Microsoft's first-party games also coming to PC. This means that you also need to worry about targeting lower-end hardware anyway, so it's really going to be the SSD that developers need to worry about actually optimizing around, and I suspect that the SSD between the two machines is going to be pretty similar. Therefore, you can do things simply like lowering resolution targets or possible frame rate reductions, and that can be one way to go. For example, on the Xbox Series X, it could run at 4K, let's say 60 FPS, and on Lockhart it could run at, let's say, 1080p at 60 FPS or what have you. And obviously the higher the resolution is you're outputting, it does start eating up an awful lot of GPU performance. I do believe though that internal native resolution is also not going to be such a big deal on the next gen systems. I think that machine learning and upsampling are going to really be the key critical factors in the next generation, because otherwise you're just wasting so much performance on rendering pixels when instead it can just be used to create better looking pixels and then use AI to upsample that to a higher resolution. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. The normal stuff if you did, like, share, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.